Well, our roles will have to be connected. There will still be a role for people because we're all people. Candidates are people. We're not recruiting robots. Yeah, we're recruiting people. And people need to feel engaged, wanted, valued. And it's very difficult, I would say, for a tool to make you feel wanted and valued. You may get a better experience or you may get a dreadful experience as a result. The wrong tool solving the wrong problem implemented badly is going to lead to terrible candidate experiences, and it's not going to deliver the right outcomes for a business.
Hello. I have with me today, I am so excited for this conversation. I have with me Paul Maxin, and he is the founding director of Max Intalent. He lives in England, but I will let you, Paul, talk about where exactly in England you're from and give us a little bit about your background.
Thank you very much. Delighted to have this conversation, Denise. Really looking forward to it. And as you can probably tell by my accent, well, I might say I don't have an accent. I live in England, in a small village, actually. It's a small country village. If any one of your viewers and listeners at your side of the pond are familiar with the TV program Grantchester, which is near Cambridge, it's a bit like that. I live in a village called Henham, not too far from Cambridge, but with easy access to London. And actually, interestingly, Cambridge is the fastest growing city in the UK. So there's a lot of business, particularly pharma and tech, around nearby. But I live in an English village. And you're right, I'm the founding director of Max Intalent. Essentially, I've been consulting with businesses on TA strategy, execution, and transformation for the last 8 years or so. Some of my key clients have been within the Publicis Group, Publicis Sapient. During the pandemic, I did a little bit of work for NHS England right early on in terms of talent strategy. And I've also spent a lot of time, a year, commuting to Berlin early on with a platform business called Zalando, which is primarily a platform business for fashion, but had been through hypergrowth and then had to rebuild or reimagine talent acquisition for them. Growing up, as it were, in my TA career, like many, I started on the agency side, but I had specifically 7 years at PwC, an experienced hire and international hiring. I was the global resourcing director also for Unilever, who at the time were responsible for 12,000 hires a year, and also at that time was going through a significant change and transformation as well. So I was there for between 7 and 8 years as well. And overall, I'm relatively long in the tooth, certainly not ready to be put out to pasture. And subjects like AI and the impact of AI, for me, talent acquisition is at a crossroads. So it's as important now, today, and the future as it ever has been. Not always recognized as such.
So let's talk about that. And I think those of us who are long in the tooth in this industry can share a lot about our experiences with people who are newer in the industry, and I think provide advice and consult to those who may have a lot of fear around some of the transformational changes that are going on right now in the industry. I've had the opportunity, like we were talking about, to interview a number of people now who have shared a lot of fabulous input on what's going on in talent acquisition right now. When you and I spoke a few weeks ago, we had talked about some of the changes that we're looking at and some of the experience that you have as well working in corporate America has, giving you, especially starting out in the agency business and then working also for corporate America, you have a great combination then and can really provide a lot of insight as to what we need to focus on right now with these transformational changes, how we're all overwhelmed right now with the changes. especially with we're inundated and drowning in AI discussions.
It seems that there is nothing else than AI discussions at the moment, and I think that shouldn't be the case. But vital though it is, it seems to be increasing both hope and fear in equal measure. The fear being about what might be done to talent acquisition, and the hope in terms of really thinking what the near future might actually look like and how things can improve and experience can improve with better automation, but also when we get to real generative AI. The reason I think that talent acquisition, the TA, is at a crossroads right now is that broadly as an industry and as a profession, not everybody's lucky enough to go to Unleash. Brilliant though it is, and you get to see what products and the potentials are out there. But as an industry, as a profession, I think talent acquisition needs to up its game a little bit on the AI curve, let alone about getting ahead of the curve. And I give a couple of reasons why, just in terms of framing the discussion, if I may. We see recently, this year, 2024, did a global AI survey. One of the outcomes of that survey, that AI could bring in an additional $15.7 billion to the global economy by 2030. That's only 6 years away, 5.5 years away. Equally, on the other side, the OECD employment outlook from last year pointed out that 27% of jobs are at a high risk of automation, including AI. And so you've got the potential and the perceived risk. Now, that doesn't mean that there will be fewer jobs. It may mean that there will be different jobs. I think, I'm probably going to paraphrase a Buddhist saying here, but the greatest power of learning is to have the ability to unlearn. And what I mean by that is that broadly, TA process, I've been around the block a few times, but broadly, an end-to-end TA process hasn't changed that much over the last 20 or 30 years. And the discussion, or not even discussion, there's a lot of talk that I'm hearing is that what will the impact be for me or the TA community with the increase in AI and generative AI. And that talk isn't so much a discussion, it's a talk. And worst case scenario, I have heard this, well, it'll be like when ATS, applicant tracking systems, came in. It'll take the drudgery out of my job and leave me available to do the more interesting bits. Well, the thing is, so much has changed in the last 5 years. And whether it's PwC or the OECD or the potential of products that you see when you've gone to Unleash recently, is it all seems a bit overwhelming sometimes. But talent acquisition doesn't and shouldn't act in isolation from the businesses that they're within. I often say that talent acquisition is I don't like the distinction between TA and the business. We're all part of the same business, and our objectives is to achieve whatever the business strategy is and the business outcomes, be that profitability and etc. So my fear is that a significant proportion of major corporate CEOs and CTOs at the moment believe they, or actually are, starting on a journey of generative AI for their companies, their corporations. And TA are very much having the discussion about the impact of AI within themselves, rather than having the discussions with the heads of TA, the heads of HR, or that leadership, being at the table and having the conversations with the CIOs and the CFOs, who are the ones that are going to have the vision for digital business transformation for the corporation. And if TA isn't part of that digital business transformation for the corporation and integrated into what those strategic and structural outcomes would be, then there's the risk that the elements of AI that we have, simply because it's AI, will not provide the outcomes or lead to successful outcomes. And then we'll still have the same discussion in 5 years' time of it's all TA's fault. And we know it seldom is. But this time the risk is it might be because we weren't part of the overarching conversation and discussions and have done our little bits around the racket wheel ourselves.
Well, let me interrupt you then right there, because so how are we going to change that dialogue then? How are we going to become part of those conversations to protect the integrity of talent acquisition and what we stand for in an organization?
Depending on the size of the organizations, I think AI has huge potential as we go the S curve in the near future and become a bit more mature on that. One of the many areas that I think it can have significant benefit is in capacity and workforce planning. What skills, and as it gets more predictive in supporting agility, internal movement, external hires, and sort of businesses alliances in order to how to get the skill sets that will be required to deliver those outcomes. I think part of that internal DBT, which digital business transformation, which many corporations are going through now, TA being involved in the discussions with capacity and workforce planning, HR in terms of the skill sets, and whoever represents people on the executive board, then it's up to the head of talent acquisition at whatever level he or she or they to be having those discussions. And one way of doing that is to prepare an initial draft strategy for the next 5 years, and it may well be wrong if you haven't, and then go to the CTO and say, can I have this discussion? This is the sort of draft strategy. But in order to execute it, we would need to know how aligned what we think these outcomes are with what the business strategy is. I've taken it from what I've seen in terms of the company reports and so on and so forth, at the town halls, the quarterly reviews and so on. But let's do some gap analysis. Does this meet the mark or not? Your business, our business rather, is investing X million dollars in business transformation, digital business transformation to become more efficient. We as TA leaders and protagonists then want to have that discussion and say, because I've just used the term investment, the corporation is investing in its digital business transformation. Talent acquisition is an integral part of the corporation because without it, you won't have the skills and productivity that is needed to deliver successful business outcomes. So we need to start thinking about talent acquisition and people as investment rather than cost. The efficiencies and experiences that will actually potentially reduce costs, but until we actually successfully have those discussions with the CIOs in large corporations about talent and talent acquisition being part of an investment in the overall transformation and digital business transformation of the organization, then we're still having these micro conversations that are a bit separate. Does that make sense?
It does. And now I have a question though. Before we have these conversations though with these business leaders, as TA executives, directors, whatnot, who's going to train us and where do we go to glean the information that we need to have constructive and current conversations that they're going to pay attention to? In other words, as TA leaders, how many of us are not prepared for these discussions? And how are we going to embark on them so that these leaders then will actually listen to what our input and follow along with some of the digital transformation measures that talent acquisition actually wants to incorporate into the business plan?
So I think there's two or three things there. None of them are mutually exclusive, but we talk now about lifelong learning as part of career development, and internally or externally, there's a little bit of a significant proportion of self-development that we need to do, and whether that's reading stuff. There's plenty of stuff online, LinkedIn, and other avenues that are sort of relatively cost effective in developing better learning for oneself. In addition to that, I would encourage, as senior leaders do, most of them have either an internal or an external coach or a mentor. Not the same thing, coaching and mentoring. And then, as I've got an opportunity to have a little bit of a platform in this conversation like you, what I do is not unique to me. There are other organizations as well that can provide that kind of short, medium, and long-term advice on that. There's no one-size-fits-all on strategy, but in terms of how a strategy can be developed, and most importantly, how to develop those conversations or openings internally within an organization so you start to get at the table.
Well, and I think, too, having been at a couple of conferences now over the last few months, let's talk about conversations that we need to have with leaders on, when it comes to the digital transformation piece of it, the software that we're going to incorporate, the automation tools that we're going to incorporate. How are we going to suggest and empower our team and the businesses with the best tools available when we don't even know what those are yet, because we're just being, slammed with so much.
Well, that's the thing. So the first port of call on that is, when it talks about the ability to unlearn, is actually just to have, almost like scenario planning. Okay. And I would start that by conversations with capacity or workforce planning. Because there is so much out there, as you know, you go to and you're slammed, and every TA leader's in-mail or email boxes are slammed on a daily basis by a plethora of new products out there. The starting point for that, to get slammed, if you will, is to determine what problem or problems we're trying to solve. And that's not a one-size-fits-all for an organization. They may be in different marketplaces, different sizes, have different strategies, maybe quite small or niche. So the starting issue is, right, what are we trying to solve? And then how do we solve it? And then what potential tools will help us on that journey? But the starting point is, one of the ways that you can start to determine what problems that you need to solve is through the sort of the 1 to 5 year business plan and the skills that you need to get, the market research, and then get an overview in terms of where the talent resides in the market. And we talk so much now about recruiting for potential. We need to determine what potential is, and that varies from organization to organization, corporation to corporation. So I would sort of think on this. Don't necessarily let what worked in the past determine how we recruit today and in the future, which is why I'm talking about why these processes need to change. There's no point in getting some AI to or computer learning, whether it's generative AI, to speed up a process that isn't going to work for what the business needs today or over the next 5 years, because things have been as they are in the next one. So I'll give an example. For me, 20 years ago, when I was talking about how you interview a candidate, we'd talk about situation, task, action, result, or some form of competency-based interviewing, whereby a scenario was painted, or that the interviewee gave examples of what they'd done in the past, being as the best determination of what you can do in the future. Well, that doesn't make any sense if the roles are going to be different, if the skill sets are going to be different. And why use the past when we're saying that the future is going to be significantly different? So it's almost like starting from scratch. Yes, use your knowledge and experience from the past, but don't let that determine what the outcome would be for the future, because it still needs to be from the business perspective. So for me, something like if you've got a video interviewing tool and you're using the technology, plugging in situation, task, action, result. For me, that doesn't make a lot of sense if you're recruiting for the present day and the future. You need to think about what and how you need to assess for potential and define what that potential is.
As a company, though, I mean, how are we going to, for business leaders, how are we going to look ahead, though, at the organization overall and know what positions we're going to need to hire for with everything changing so rapidly? And we don't even really understand yet how AI is going to affect that and how the tools and automation that we're going to acquire and incorporate into our organizations is going to affect what we're doing.
Yeah, great question. The first part of the answer is to be very wary of either a product or a personal collection of people that says we're future-proofing. Nothing is future-proof. One of my pet hates now is if I hear the term future-proof, which is in common parlance. I think we have to recognize that there's no such thing as future-proofing because things are changing so much. Yes, we need to have a variety of scenarios and scenario planning, and we can't do that as TA leaders or TA protagonists or practitioners in isolation from the rest of the organization, which is why I'm talking about connections with capacity and workforce planning, why the leaders need to step into the conversations that CIOs are having, because they are the ones that are leading the digital business transformation. The capacity and workforce planning is, if they're connected with their leaders, then they'll have some determination on what the skills needed are for the future. One of my sort of things, and we also, to your point, need to train more junior TA people as well, but also not be afraid of reverse mentoring or reverse conversation. So I'm Ajax, been around for a long time. Back in the days when we used to have a Rolodex system of cards. Clearly things have changed and I've grown with those changes. But also be willing, because it's up to us to unlearn as well. So why don't we respect, or we must respect, the probability that some of those ideas for change are going to come from people who are new into talent acquisition and see things differently from their own perspectives, and not just the way that they interact with companies, the way they interact with each other and products and their lives. So it's entirely feasible that these it could democratize. It has it's the benefit of democratizing the scenario planning and discussions. Now, somebody who's a little bit more experienced may then sort of challenge, push back and whatever, but that actually helps the discussion flow. So a senior person maybe just to push back or probe, but the enthusiasm of somebody who's actually just seeing things through a different angle and lens through their own lived experiences is going to have as much sway in those discussions and scenario planning as a senior leader.
I so agree. Yeah, in fact, when we were at the Transform conference, I had the opportunity to meet 3 Gen Z people and interview them, and we had terrific conversations. The piece of that, though, is without showing bias, how do we make sure to include people from the younger generations into the conversations for real discussions? And again, without being accused of showing bias for their group versus another age group, or people who are somewhere in the middle between people who've been in the business for a long time. And
I think each, and also from a complete E&I perspective, so diversity and inclusion and a number of, we're not all the same. Yeah, and we think different. So generationally, I read something somewhere, I think within the last week or so, and I wish I could remember the name of the study or the publication. It was in the workplace that an increasingly low percent of, because of baby boomers like me, are hanging around a bit longer, are having conversations with Gen Zs, or vice versa, because they kind of, Gen Z would think of somebody in my generation as a yeah, like their parents or whatever, although it may or may not be. So I think we have to, there's something around, and there is a role around engagement that in organizations and corporations can play in engaging across the corporations, but within corporations as well. So that's, and that is, and I would include not just age or genders or ethnicity, but neurodiversity in that as well. But that actually, there are a lot of very successful people who are neurodiverse, whether that is, and there are lots, whether that is autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia, and it impacts probably a greater proportion of the population than we are aware of. So they're not necessarily visible differences, but they're impactful differences in terms of the way that people behave. But someone who is has ADHD, for instance, who may be a brilliant programmer or engineer, may think differently in terms of the way that certain patterns. Somebody who has a motor issue, if something's based on the speed, so I'm deliberately doing this in front of the camera, the speed that they have to press a bit of a keyboard to see, that is also potential bias against them as well. In the same way that I used to have a stutter as a child. I have ways of overcoming that now as somebody who's much older, although you can still hear it sometimes. That will be an example, is that if you're doing a video interview and it's a programmed video interview, that will have an impact on potential selection processes. So there are all sorts of potential biases to overcome that should be part of the overall conversation. And if we don't have these conversations in all sorts of different scenarios, then we're going to get found wanting.
I knew a software engineer once who had ADHD, but he used to go off of his medication for work because he worked better programming without medication than he did with medication. So, and then, I also have had an experience working with somebody who has autism. Mm-hmm. And that person was very dedicated, and you could put that person on task and that person would stay on task much better than the rest of us could. That's very interesting. So what about then, you talk about unlearning. I love that conversation. And unlearning to what point though? I mean, there's, again, a number of us who've been in the business for a long time, and we don't want to overlook some of the skills, like you said, and experience that we've had that could be applicable or helpful as we move forward. So how are we going to train ourselves and know what we need to unlearn versus carry forward into the future?
There's a little bit of trial and error in the same way that you're building a minimum viable product in the tech world. As we strip things right back, one way of looking at it is to build a succession of minimum viable trial and error. It's essentially trial and error. But I would also say when we're talking about AI as well, which kind of going back full circle on this, is that we need to test and retest all tools. Most importantly, do some randomized controlled trials. Because what you don't want is to have bias in that then goes on steroids magnifying bias. Even to the extent of just going right back, so testing tools in comparison to random selection. You do need to do a little bit of that, and then to feed those random selection outcomes back into the AI, so it's actually learning from that as well. Because if random selection is also kind of on a par in finding people with as with AI. That means that a lot of people, talent, are being missed. And not only will the candidates having bad experiences about being missed, it's because we've become so reliant on the tool. And as the tool is learning, we're not testing it with randomized control tests. And I think that is something that I would build into any project and continue that. That's the point. One of the points I meant by you never future-proofing anything. As soon as you sit back because you've implemented a system or a bit of AI and then just let it do its work, then it's never up to date. It's up to date at the point you implemented it.
Okay, that brings up an interesting question for me. And I appreciate you saying that, because I think that we've already been there with some of the tools that we've been using. Before job boards, think about it, how we used to recruit, right? We picked up the phone and called people. I mean, we used to call into companies. I mean, and it was funny because I remember I had a different name I used when I called into companies versus my real name. My pseudonym was Lisa Bradley. I know, I'm telling on myself here. But yeah, I can remember calling when we were looking for programmer analysts. I mean, even that title has changed right over the years. So, we used to pick up the phone and call into companies and
potentially misappropriating telephone directories.
Right, exactly. And then all of a sudden job boards came along, and we let the job boards do the recruiting for us and the sourcing, right? And it helped to speed things up. And it helped us to reach more candidates in a much shorter period of time. And all of a sudden now we were doing what we called high volume recruiting as a result of that. Correct? High volume recruiting was not a term that we heard 30 years ago. Using the job boards, using the tools that we have had, LinkedIn, Indeed, Monster back when it was viable, Career Builder, all of those. It changed the way we recruited. And so now here we are, and you're talking about, okay, we're going to have to look at the tools that we're going to need moving forward, but how is that going to change what we're doing now? And you were talking about the roles are going to change. How do you foresee, Paul, the roles changing? And if you have a crystal ball, what are our roles going to be called in 5 years? And what are they going to look like?
Well, it's not every single role is going to change. There's still going to be people working in supermarkets maybe less on the till, but in the supply chain. But those roles in the supply chain might change. It might be how am I going to manage this robot to take the product from one part to the other, rather than stack the shelves myself physically. So that is an example. But there'll be other roles. There'll still be people there'll still be manual, the elements of roles that will continue to be manual. Medical doctors will still need to be medical doctors, but obviously they will be at the height of AI, because as AI improves not just diagnostics, but treatments as well. A surgeon may have qualified as a surgeon through many, many years of study, general practice, become a consultant, and then a surgeon. I'm not in that field, but that might have taken, let's say, 10, 15 years growing. But their learning doesn't stop on that, because with AI, diagnostics are improving immeasurably for prevention, treatment, and cure. And prevention is different from cure. So from their perspective, from the perspective of a doctor, then they will have some of those roles will change, because there will be elements of what they're doing to prevent or cure that will have become automated, or help use the AI outcomes to help inform them as to what those solutions can be. So I've kind of gone from a supermarket to a surgeon.
That's okay though, because it's going to impact everybody, right?
But it does impact.
But going back to like human resources and talent acquisition, though, how is it going to affect our roles, and what are our roles going to look like?
Well, our roles will have to be connected to what those changes will be. So there will still be a role for people. because we're all people. Candidates are people. We're not recruiting robots. We're recruiting people. And people need to feel engaged, wanted, valued. And it's very difficult, I would say, for an AI, for a tool to make you feel wanted and valued. It may get a better experience, or you may get a dreadful experience as a result of the tool. The wrong tool solving the wrong problem implemented badly is going to lead to terrible candidate experiences, and it's not going to deliver the right outcomes for a business. But I think within talent acquisition leaders will need to be more strategic and business savvy in having those conversations that they need to have with business leaders. Having been involved in the business transformation, digital business transformation, and continued digital business transformation, because they're at the fat end of the funnel in terms of how to attract and assess people. So those roles will still exist. For those, let's say, that are new into the profession, into the industry, and I think their roles will be potentially less processed, but they need to learn how to use the AI. So their learning will be, so if you've got that's at its most simple, a job description tool, and that in those that have been around in one form or another, whether it's to detect bias or otherwise, but now they're getting more sophisticated, not just for bias, but to be on brand and authentic. People new into talent acquisition and within that, employer branding. One of the, if you will, they will need to learn how to use the AI. So if it's writing a job description, okay, the AI can absolutely help.
Right. And it does now.
Yeah.
I mean, we're using it now I'm using it now for, yeah. And I like the way, and I think that it's more effective. I think that, plus I love the way that AI gives you 3 options when you ask it to write a position description for a specific role. And it'll give you 3 different options and you can kind of cut and paste. And so it's very user friendly, I think. But in terms of my role as a recruiter or as a sourcer, that's the other thing that comes up a lot in discussions right now. How is my role as a sourcer or a recruiter going to change? I think that from what I've gleaned from other conversations, a lot of the people who consider themselves sourcing specialists right now, identifying candidates for clients or for the companies they're working for, they have the most fear that their roles are going to go away due to automation, right? And due to some of the generative AI tools that are coming into the market, that their companies are going to be acquiring or have already acquired and are using. So how are their roles going to change? What do they have to look forward to?
Yeah, so that's also, well, as examples, I would say sources have every right to be involved in randomized control trials that I was talking about earlier. Testing tools, when I talked about random selection, then test the tools compared to random selection and sourcer selection as well. And if the sources are coming up close to the AI tools that you've got, or bettering them, but even, not necessarily bettering them, even if it's like 50% and 50%, it still means that you're missing great candidates. So I think the role of a sourcer will potentially evolve into one that's not competing with the AI, but complementing the AI to improve the AI.
Okay. So, for example, if somebody's doing an executive search and they're utilizing a tool, let's say they're utilizing ChatGPT right now, and they're using it for, and I can't think of, oh my gosh, there's so many of them out there that I've been using. Oh, there's a few right now that are new sourcing tools that are using AI. course, some of them, I think they say they're using it. They say that they're an AI tool, but I don't know. Again, too, you'd have to do random selection. You'd have to just try it out and see how well it really works. Bridge what
Yeah,
we're used
and
to, right?
never trust a vendor to audit their own product either.
Exactly. That's funny. Never trust a vendor to order their own product. Okay, that is good. Anyways, and there's a few I am trying out right now. I mean, because people ask us all the time, "Hey, will you test drive our product and tell us what you think?" And I'm happy to do so to some degree. I mean, you can spend all day trying out people's products though as well. But I think that, like, for example, though, if we've got a search and you're utilizing one of these tools or Chat GPT or whatnot, at what point though is your input though going to benefit, to your point, benefit the tool that you're using, and how is that complementary collaboration, if you would, with that tool going to enhance your role, and what are we going to learn from it? In other words, I think that we unlearned back when we started using job boards. There was a lot we unlearned, not picking up the phone and calling people ourselves, right? Because now the tool is doing it for us. So I guess my question then is, how are these new tools going to complement what we're going to be doing and keep us on that track of being the advisor or being the person who is working as the human part of the equation?
Yeah, well, not losing the human part of the equation, working backwards from that, is essential. If you're talking about executive hiring, um, a senior person is not going to join an organization without having had human interaction in a valuable way. It's just so. This is what I'm saying. So that's why I'm going back to say, learn the lessons of the past, as you said. Some basic skills of how to use a telephone were in landlines with the advent of job boards. So this is where people that have been through other transitions and transformations over the course of the last period of time, or the advent of applicant tracking systems. Name me a recruiter that loves their applicant tracking system. Not very many. One of the reasons for that, in terms of lessons of the past, is because the talent acquisition leads, more often than not, weren't engaged in the conversations with the CIOs or IT, whatever, and then just had stuff, or with their chief people officers or people leads, because then they had something that was just came in with the HRIS or whatever, and this is it. You haven't had the input. So this is an opportunity. This is what I mean at the crossroads. It's an inflection point for us to step up and be part of that conversation, but not just within TA. And I have gone off a little bit of piece. So then just go back. So let's learn the lessons of the past. So for a sourcer of today and over the next 5 years, it should be in some ways an exciting time, because the majority of people will not want to join an organization unless they've had human interaction. So if the AI helps provide a better list for sources to then interact in a human way and then determine fit, for want of a better expression, then they've got the benefit of tools, but they're still going to have to interact in a human way. And by that, I mean, people like to talk to people. And if you can't talk to a person, then you're going to struggle with it all within a corporation.
You're absolutely right. It's funny though. I have a gut feeling that the title sourcer could take a backseat or maybe go away. If you think about it, Paul, years ago, we didn't have the distinction of sourcer. We were just all called recruiters, right? I mean, when did we have the distinction between a sourcer and a recruiter? How long ago did we make that distinction? 10, 15 years ago, maybe, right? So prior to that, we were just all called recruiters. Some of us were called full cycle recruiters or full desk recruiters, I think. Yeah, right. Others, I can't remember what other titles did we go by back then? Contract recruiters. But I think with the tools that we've been using is where we came up with this distinction. But now if we're going to utilize tools that are going to be effective, and as we find them and as we do those random surveys and discover which tools are going to be best, And hopefully we'll find something besides just LinkedIn where there's not these monopolies being set up.
Dare I say it, LinkedIn, by dint of being a monopoly and starting to use its own AI as well, as you notice how things are subtly changing.
Right.
But yes, I mean, many organizations actually can't afford LinkedIn price strategy has changed immeasurably.
Well, and that's why I think too that we'll see more recruiter titles catching on, or talent acquisition specialist or something like that, where there's not going to be maybe such a fine distinction between the front end of recruiting and the back end of recruiting like we see now. I do see that changing. And I just think because we've been in this business for a long time and we've seen the changes and the transformations that have taken place up to today. I don't know. For some reason, I just see that kind of
But
taking a step
that in
backwards a
and of
little bit.
itself is not necessarily a bad thing.
No, no, not at all.
It's continued lifelong learning. So the roles or the skills will evolve and change and develop accordingly. But it doesn't mean that they go away, or it doesn't mean that you go away.
Right, right. Like you said, our roles just transform. Again, I think it'll be important for some of the leaders of today to move forward with. And I know at Unleash they had a lot of executive meetings, boardroom meetings, and whatnot with leaders on these conversations. I think that some of the people I spoke with have indicated there are training and learning development going on right now to bring people in HR and TA up to speed on what they need to do to advance themselves, to prepare themselves for the changes that are happening. So I think from that perspective, but I love what you're saying about incorporating what we do in talent acquisition with the business, because that is the most important aspect of it. We are part of the business and not a sole separate and not isolated.
A few kind of things that make the hairs on the back of my neck. Well, and I mentioned future proof, and also the other one is when I hear people talking about within TA talking about the business. Well, in that you're already and people in the business talking about talent acquisition. You've already created a barrier just with the language, and that then leads to barrier of behavior. So a corporate, we're all doing different things in the same team, which is to deliver a successful outcome. But it starts with what the business strategy is and what the successful business outcomes are, and how are they going to be delivered with people, and what skills are those people going to need to do, and how are they going to operate to deliver those successful outcomes. And unless talent acquisition is part of that conversation, then for too long we've been going on the hamster wheel of having discussions within TA about whether it's even what's going to change and how that changes, without actually having conversations with the business to gain the insight to determine what problems we need to solve within talent acquisition, and then how we can better use the tools that are being developed to solve them.
So I have a question for you around that. What about the distinction then between globally? Let's talk globally for a second. How do you see the landscape changing for, well, I should say, who do you see advancing first globally in this market?
I will answer the question, but one thing I'd just like to caveat in that, and are the risks, and they're the risks around regulation. So in the EU, for instance, and I'm sure I don't know enough about individual states in the US, but the EU have within the last 10 years or so have had what they call GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. But the EU, the European Union, has passed an act this year which has determined that recruitment is high risk. And that's the EU AI Act, Artificial Intelligence Act. So this is one way of talent acquisition leaders getting into the conversation with the chief information officers. because the four things that the Act determines must happen: high quality data set, clear user information, human oversight, and accuracy and cybersecurity. Some of those, human oversight is important. So, what human oversight do we actually need to make those decisions? Now, so that's going to be like GDPR on steroids once it rolls out across the European Union. And the fines for non-compliance are extortionate. So either 35 million euros up to, or 7% of global turnover, whichever's the greater. So that should help start a conversation as well, and a connected conversation within corporations. And I'm sure, I don't quite know how, I don't know enough about regulation state by state in the US, but I'm sure it's going to, there's some in New York which isn't dissimilar, but I don't know. I'm not the best person to determine that. But an ITA regulation will also have an impact. In some ways, in a higher regulated geographic area, such as the EU, it won't be long before the first big case of non-compliance comes to light. And then that in and of itself will do one of two things. And this is where you have your scenarios. It might put the brakes on, worst case scenario, on digital business transformation within talent acquisition because everybody's suddenly scared about what's happened to organization X. Or it might lead to greater, better transformation because we don't want to get caught out like that. So how do we ensure that these four key factors are watertight? It's not quite answered your question around what's going to happen. I think it might happen differently. So in lower regulated environments, you might get more, might use, might get to a position on the upper part of the S curve for sort of generative AI, but it more quickly, but it might not necessarily lead to the desired outcome because there aren't the checks and balances inbuilt within the system or the regulations involved around that. Does that so I don't know the answer to that. I can say scenario planning. Well, what happens if it goes down this route, and it can go down this route, which is quite different. And then if you have to, with your scenario plan, course correct rapidly depending on what happens. And again, that's another reason why you can't future-proof anything. You always have to course correct.
Well, and I just wonder, though, based on what you're telling me, how many countries and regions are going to embrace something like what you're talking about that the EU is doing. What did you call it? You used an acronym.
But it's an adjunct of GDPR, which also in the UK as well as the EU, which stands for General Data Protection Regulation.
Because I just wonder if we won't start embracing what's going to work for the EU, if it's working for the EU, and I don't know where the US is on. We hear a lot in the news about protecting our data as it relates to like the semiconductor industry, for example, and bringing the semiconductor industry back to the US from the other regions that have been providing us with the semiconductor chips over the last number of years. So there's a lot of conversation around that. But with respect to AI, I mean, we hear bits and pieces about some of the regulations they're trying to enact, but nothing as specific. I haven't anyway heard anything as specific as the GDPR.
I think we need to keep on for that. I mean, yeah, outside of this, I know there are all sorts of, the world is not a particularly stable place at the moment. And there's a lot of elections going on, not just in the US, in the UK, and in India, all taking place this year. And there are obviously conflicts we know about. And there's a kind of a lack of stability there, and that also may well play into the directions that there may be, whilst things are a little bit unstable, that might also lead to a little bit of a pause on all of this. And let's just get 2024 over and done with, and then we can start to speak. I actually don't. I think this is the ideal time, because of those pauses, to have these discussions and scenario plannings. Because until we kind of see what the outcomes are of sort of various geopolitical crises, and then, as you said, the semiconductor chips or cybersecurity, the TikTok discussion that's ongoing in the US.
Oh my gosh.
And so forth. So all of these will have some kind of impact.
Well, Paul, I so appreciate your time, and we'll have other conversations, I'm sure, because this is an ongoing conversation. It's not going to stop here. So we will stay in contact, and that way we can kind of pick up where we left off as we hit a different plateau and a different peak with our industry. It'll be great to continue conversations with you. Thank you so, so much. I really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you for inviting me onto your great podcast. I really appreciate it. And yes, if this is the first of a number of discussions, then that's it, because we won't have the answers to all the questions.
No, we don't. No.